Be my wife, the stranger said. Just for a while. Lillian Hayes had 37 cents a broken bag, and Gerald Pratt's threat still burning in her ears. The most powerful man in Caldwell County refused to his face on Main Street in front of everyone. Every door in this town had already closed against her. She had nowhere to sleep, nowhere to run, and nothing left to bargain with. Then a quiet rancher stepped out of the shadow of a livery stable, looked at her once, and offered her the only thing money couldn't buy. His name. His protection. A lie built to survive a much bigger truth. She said yes. Neither of them expected what came next. Lillian had not planned to defy Gerald Pratt. That was the honest truth of it, and honesty was one of the few things she still owned free and clear. She had walked into Caldwell that morning on the morning stage from Cheyenne carrying everything she had left in the world inside a carpet bag whose brass latch had broken somewhere between the second and third relay station. She held it shut with her left hand the entire ride and told herself it didn't matter because the bag was nearly empty anyway. 37 cents. A change of clothes. A letter of reference from a woman in Denver who was probably already regretting having written it. She had arrived in Caldwell looking for honest work, a boarding house, a dress shop, a hotel that needed a housekeeper who asked no questions and expected no favors. That was all she wanted. Not a new life. Not rescue. Just enough ground under her feet to stop running. Gerald Pratt had spotted her within 20 minutes of her arrival. She would learn later that this was not unusual. Pratt had arrangements with the stage drivers, with the hotel clerk, with the woman who ran the only respectable boarding house in town. Every unattached woman who came through Caldwell on that coach was noted, categorized, and evaluated within the hour. Pratt ran this county the way some men ran a chessboard, every piece accounted for every move anticipated. He approached her outside the mercantile hat, in hand, smile precise, and practiced. "Miss Hayes," he said, though she had not given her name to anyone yet. "I understand you're looking for a position." She should have been afraid right then. She knew that now. But she had spent the last 3 years being afraid of men who smiled like that, and somewhere between Denver and Cheyenne, she had run clean out of the kind of fear that made her go quiet. "I'm looking for work," she said. "Honest work. Of course." His smile didn't change. "I have a large household. I need a woman of quality to manage it. The position comes with a room, meals, and a fair wage." "What else does it come with?" The smile held for exactly 1 beat too long. "Stability, Miss Hayes. Security. Protection from the kind of difficulties a woman alone tends to encounter. And what would you require in return for that protection?" He studied her the way a man studies something he intends to purchase, unhurried, confident the transaction will go his way. "Loyalty," he said. "Discretion. An understanding of who holds authority in this household." Lillian picked up her carpet bag and looked at him squarely. "Thank you for the offer, Mr. Pratt. I'll find something else." The smile finally broke. "Miss Hayes." His voice dropped to something that was not quite a threat, and not quite anything else. "I want you to think carefully. There is one decent boarding house in Caldwell, and Mrs. Aldrich takes only women I vouch for. The hotel doesn't rent to single women. The dress shop has no openings. And the woman who might have hired you for kitchen work was told this morning not to expect you." She stared at him. "You haven't even met me until this moment. I received word you were coming on the morning stage." He tilted his head. "I like to be prepared." "You arranged all of that before I even stepped off the coach." "I arranged options," he said. "I'm offering you the best one." The street was not empty. 3 men loitered near the post office. A woman in a gray bonnet had stopped on the opposite boardwalk with a market basket over her arm, watching without appearing to watch. The hotel clerk stood in the doorway of his establishment, making a study of the middle distance. Every one of them, Lillian understood, was Pratt's. She thought about 37 cents. She thought about the broken latch on her bag. She thought about Denver and what had happened the last time she had walked into a position offered by a man with a practiced smile and a county full of arrangements. "No," she said. His face went still. "No." He repeated very quietly. No, Mr. Pratt, thank you. No. She turned and walked away from him on Main Street, in front of his 3 loitering men and his woman, with the market basket, and his hotel clerk in the doorway. And she had no idea where she was going. She only knew she was not going back. She heard him say behind her, still quiet, "You'll reconsider." She did not look back. She had walked the length of Main Street twice before she understood the full weight of what she had done. Mrs. Aldrich's boarding house had a full sign in the window, though Lillian could count the horses at the hitching post and knew it was not full. The hotel clerk met her eyes when she pushed through the door and shook his head before she opened her mouth. The dress shop, a narrow place with a bell above the door that rang thin and sharp when she entered, had a woman behind the counter who looked at Lillian with something that might have been sympathy and then looked away. "I can't help you," the woman said softly. "I'm sorry." "He got here before me." "He always does." Lillian stood on the boardwalk outside the dress shop and took stock of the situation with the same flat, practical honesty she had been applying to difficult situations since she was 19 years old. She had no room, no food coming, no prospects in this town that Pratt didn't control. She had enough money to buy herself 1 meal, possibly 2 if she was careful, before she was entirely without resources. The next stage out of Caldwell didn't run until Thursday, which was 3 days away, and she did not have the fare. She had walked into this town with almost nothing and managed to make her situation demonstrably worse within the first hour. She sat down on the edge of the boardwalk because her legs were tired and because she was out of ideas, and she put the carpet bag on her knees and held it shut with both hands this time, and she stared at the dirt street and tried to think. That was when she heard the voice. "You're the woman who told Gerald Pratt no on Main Street." It wasn't a question. She looked up. He was leaning against the wall of the livery stable across the street, had been there the whole time. Apparently watching, or not watching, impossible to tell. He was tall, lean, dressed in work clothes that were clean but not new. He had the look of a man who spent his days outside and had stopped noticing it years ago. His hat was pulled low. His eyes, when she could see them, were gray. "Who's asking?" she said. "Jake Walker." He didn't move from the wall. "I run the Walker Ranch 2 miles east." "Good for you." "You're in trouble," he said. "I can see that myself, thank you. You need somewhere to be that Pratt can't touch." She looked at him steadily. "What kind of somewhere?" He was quiet for a moment. Not the silence of a man choosing his words carefully. The silence of a man who had already decided but wanted to make sure he was saying it straight. "Be my wife," he said. "Just for a while. Long enough for the situation to sort itself out." The word hit her like cold water. "I don't know you." "No." "You don't know me." "No." "Then why?" "Because Pratt's been trying to get his hands on the water access east of Caldwell for 2 years. Jake Walker said, and 3 of the ranchers who might have stopped him are already gone. I'm the last one who's held. A married man holds different ground than a single one in this territory, and you need ground to stand on." He paused. Those 2 problems fit together. She stared at him. "You're proposing a business arrangement." "I'm proposing you don't sleep in the street Thursday night. And in exchange, you use my name, stay at the ranch, act the part well enough that Pratt believes it, and decides you're not worth the trouble anymore." He pushed off the wall slightly. "I'll sleep in the barn if that's what makes you comfortable. You'll have your own room, your own space. Nobody will touch you." "You're a stranger offering me a marriage of convenience in the middle of a cattle town," Lillian said. "That is not a normal sentence." "No," he agreed. "It's not." She looked at him for a long time. She had learned to read. Men had learned it the hard way, learned it in Denver, learned it in the year before Denver, and the 2 years after. She looked for the tells, the eagerness that meant desperation, the too steady eye contact that meant calculation, the small, satisfied smile that meant he thought he already owned her. Jake Walker had none of those things. He looked like a man stating a practical problem and offering a practical solution with no particular attachment to whether she accepted or not. "If I say yes," she said carefully, and I discover you lied about any part of what you've told me, I will find a way to make your life considerably more complicated than it already is." Something moved in his face. Not quite a smile. Something quieter than that. "That's fair, and if I decide to leave, you won't stop me. You can leave any time you want. I'll give you stage fare." She looked at him for another long moment. Then she stood up, picked up her carpet bag, and said, "All right, Mr. Walker, for a while." The ride out to the Walker Ranch took 40 minutes in Jake's wagon, and he spoke perhaps 100 words the entire way. He told her the names of his 2 ranch hands, Cal Briggs, who had been with him 6 years, and a younger man everyone called Denny. He told her the house had 4 rooms, and she would have the back bedroom, which had a bolt on the inside of the door. He told her Mrs. Aldrich had a cousin who would talk, so the news of their marriage would be through Caldwell by morning, whether they announced it or not. "You've thought about this," she said. "I think about most things before I do them. How long have you been thinking about this particular thing?" "Since I saw you walk out of Pratt's conversation, looking like you'd rather burn the town down than give him an inch." A pause. "I figured a woman with that particular look might be worth the complication." She didn't know what to say to that, so she said nothing. The ranch was not what she expected. She had imagined roughness, a working place with no consideration given to comfort, a bachelor's house where everything was functional and nothing else. Instead, she found a structure that was worn at the edges but carefully kept. The porch boards were replaced where they'd rotted. The windows were clean. There was a kitchen garden along the south wall, somewhat overgrown, but not abandoned, as if someone had once tended it with care, and then stopped, but couldn't bring themselves to let it die entirely. Cal Briggs met them at the fence gate. He was somewhere around 40, with a weathered face and the particular stillness of a man who had worked hard land for enough years that he'd stopped being surprised by anything. He looked at Lillian. He looked at Jake. "This is Lily," Jake said. "My wife." Cal Briggs studied her for a moment, with the same flat assessment she'd gotten from Jake, and then he touched the brim of his hat. "Ma'am," he said, "welcome to Walker Ranch." That was all. No questions. No visible surprise. Just acknowledgement. And then he turned back to whatever he'd been doing before they arrived. "He's not curious?" she asked Jake quietly as they went to the house. "He's plenty curious," Jake said. "He just knows it's not his business unless I make it his business." She had expected the first night to be the hardest part. She had been in situations before where a man offered one thing and meant something else, where the terms of an arrangement shifted the moment she was inside a house with a closed door. She had slept with her back to walls and her ears trained for footsteps. She was not naive about what men considered their due. Jake Walker knocked on the door of the back bedroom at 7 in the evening and said through the door that there was food on the table if she wanted it. She opened the door. He was already walking back toward the kitchen. She ate at a table across from a man she had known for 6 hours, and neither of them spoke much, and the silence was not hostile. It was the silence of 2 people who were conserving energy for something larger than conversation. "Pratt will come to the ranch," she said. "Yes." "What do we tell him?" "The truth near as we can manage it. We married quick. That's not unheard of out here." "He'll want to know more." "He always does." Jake pushed his plate back. "The best thing with Pratt is to give him less than he's looking for. He fills in gaps with his own assumptions, and his assumptions usually run toward believing people are as calculating as he is. And if he sends someone to check the county records..." Jake looked at her steadily. "I filed papers this afternoon before I came to town." She stared at him. "You filed marriage papers before you'd spoken to me." "I filed papers that could become marriage papers, depending on whether you said yes." That is an extraordinary degree of advance planning." "I told you. I think about most things before I do them." She sat back in her chair and looked at him across the table. This man she had met 7 hours ago, who had already built a partial legal structure around a conversation that hadn't happened yet, and she felt something that was not quite trust, and not quite the opposite of trust. Something in between. The beginning of a tentative map. "What happened to the garden?" she asked. "The one on the south side." A small silence. Different from the others. "My mother planted it," he said. "She died 3 years ago. I'm sorry. She was a practical woman." He said it simply, without grief, exactly the way people speak of someone they have finished mourning but not forgotten. She would have thought this whole arrangement was completely sensible. Would she? "She married my father 2 weeks after meeting him because she needed a way out of a bad situation, and he needed someone who wasn't afraid of a hard winter." He picked up his coffee cup. They were married 31 years. Lillian looked at the table. "That's either very reassuring," she said slowly, "or extremely alarming." Something moved in Jake Walker's face again, that same almost but not quite smile. "Probably both," he said. My bad. 3 days after her arrival, the first problem came from inside the town. She had gone into Caldwell with Jake to establish the story to be seen together at the mercantile, at the post office, at the feed store where Jake did his regular business. She stayed close and let the town watch, and said what needed to be said, and shook the hands that needed to be shaken. And by the end of the morning, she could feel the weight of Caldwell's collective assessment settling around her like a garment she hadn't chosen. Mrs. Aldrich, the boarding housekeeper who had refused her a room, stopped them outside the post office. "Mrs. Walker," she said with a brightness that was entirely manufactured. "What a surprise. I'd heard that as I didn't realize you and Jake were acquainted." "We are," Lillian said pleasantly. "Very." "Of course." Mrs. Aldrich's eyes were moving between her and Jake with the speed of someone performing rapid calculations. "And you've come from, where was it?" "Cheyenne," Lillian said, which was true. "Then, before that, Kansas," which was also true if you went back far enough. "Ah." Mrs. Aldrich smiled with her mouth. "Gerald Pratt mentioned he'd spoken with you when you first arrived. He was concerned you might have misunderstood his offer of employment." "I understood it perfectly," Lillian said. "I simply chose different employment." Jake put his hand briefly on the small of her back, just for a moment, just enough to read as what it was meant to read as, and said, "Lily, we should get to the feed store before Hendricks closes up." They walked away from Mrs. Aldrich together, and Lillian kept her chin level and her pace even, and when they were far enough down the street, she said quietly, "She'll go straight to Pratt." "Yes." "He'll start asking questions about Cheyenne." "Yes." "Is there anything in Cheyenne that would be a problem?" Jake glanced at her sideways. "Is there anything in Cheyenne that would be a problem for you?" She thought about Denver, about what had happened there, about a man named Howard Vance, and a series of events that had unraveled her life so thoroughly she'd ended up on a morning stage with 37 cents and a broken bag latch. "Not in Cheyenne," she said carefully. He heard what she didn't say. She could tell by the way he went quiet, not dismissive quiet, but the kind of quiet that meant he was storing the information and would not push on it yet. "All right," he said, "one problem at a time." The second problem came that evening. She was in the kitchen when she heard the hoofbeats, more than one horse, more than a social call's worth. She looked through the window and saw 3 riders coming up the ranch road, and she recognized the man in front by his posture before she could see his face. Gerald Pratt. Jake was already on the porch by the time Pratt dismounted. She came to stand in the doorway, visible present, a wife at the door of her husband's house, and watched Jake wait at the porch rail with his arms at his sides. "Jake," Pratt said. "Gerald." Pratt's eyes moved to her immediately. He looked at her the way he had looked at her on Main Street, assessing, calculating, and then he looked back at Jake with an expression that was trying to decide what to be. "I heard you got married," he said. "Did you?" "Quick work." Pratt put one foot on the porch step without being invited up. "I spoke with this woman myself not 3 days ago. I offered her honest employment." "She found something better," Jake said. "She found something faster," Pratt said. "That's not the same thing." He looked at Lillian again. "Mrs. Walker, you should know that I had some concerns about a woman arriving in this county alone with no references and no established connections." "She has connections now," Jake said. "Jake," Pratt's voice shifted not louder but flatter. "You've been a reasonable man to do business with." I'd hate to see that change because you move too fast on something you don't have full information about. What information am I missing? A pause. Pratt smiled. I've sent some letters. To Cheyenne. And to Denver. He let that sit in the air between them. Just to make sure everyone is who they say they are. I'm sure it'll all come to nothing. He tipped his hat to Lillian. Ma'am? He said. He walked back to his horse and rode away with his 2 men, and the dust settled, and Jake turned to look at her, and she looked back at him, and the thing that had been waiting under the surface of everything for 3 days finally came to the top. He's going to find something in Denver, she said. Jake waited. There was a man, she said. His name is Howard Vance. She stopped, started again. He destroyed my reputation in Denver, deliberately, systematically. He is very good at it, and he has done it before, and when Pratt's letters find him, and he will come here and do it again. Jake looked at her for a long moment. Why? Because I know something about him, she said. Something he cannot afford to have known. And the best way to silence a woman is to make sure no one will believe her before she opens her mouth. The silence stretched. What do you know? Jake asked. She looked at him, this man she had known for 3 days who had filed papers before speaking to her, who had given her a room with a bolt on the inside of the door, who had put his hand on the small of her back on Main Street to protect a story that was at least partly true. Enough, she said. I know enough to ruin him, and he knows it. Jake Walker stepped off the porch and stood in the ranch yard, and looked up the road where Pratt's dust was still settling. How long do we have? He said. Before Vance arrives, she calculated. 2 weeks, maybe 3 if the mail runs slow. Jake nodded slowly. Then we have 2 weeks to be ready, he said. Ready for what? He looked back at her. And for the first time since she'd met him, something in his face was entirely unguarded. Ready to make sure that when Vance gets here, he said, he finds out he made a very serious mistake picking someone on my land to go after. Lillian Hayes had spent 3 years running from Howard Vance. She had run from Denver to Pueblo to Cheyenne to a morning stage with 37 cents and a broken latch and a town that shut its doors before she'd put her foot down. She had never in 3 years had anyone tell her they intended to stand in front of her. She looked at Jake Walker standing in the yard of his mother's ranch with the evening coming down around him and the dust still settling from Gerald Pratt's departure, and she felt something move through her chest that she did not have a clean name for. All right, she said very quietly. Then let's get ready. The 2 weeks Jake had predicted stretched into 10 days before the first letter arrived. Lillian knew it had come before Jake told her. She read it in the way Cal Briggs walked to the house instead of sending Denny, and in the way he knocked twice and waited instead of calling through the door. She was in the kitchen when Jake opened the envelope, and she stayed where she was and listened to the paper unfold and the silence that followed it. Then Jake came to the doorway. It's from Mrs. Aldrich's cousin, he said. She has a friend in Denver who knows a woman who used to work for Vance. What does it say? He read it aloud. It said that Howard Vance had been asking questions about a woman named Lillian Hayes. It said he had described her as unstable, dishonest, prone to fabrication. It said he had told at least 2 people that she had stolen from him before she left Denver. It said he was making arrangements to travel. Lillian stood very still and let the words move through her without reacting to them. She had heard variations of all of it before. Vance had been running that particular story for 3 years, adjusting the details to fit the audience, adding specifics when the situation called for it, always careful to sound regretful rather than angry, as if he were a decent man forced to speak hard truths about someone who had disappointed him. He's good at it, she said. The lying. The particular kind of lying that sounds like concern. She dried her hands on a kitchen cloth. He never sounds vindictive. That's the part that makes it work. He sounds like a man who is genuinely sorry to have to say these things. Jake set the letter on the table. What did you actually take from him? She looked up. Nothing. He held her gaze. I took nothing from Howard Vance, she said quietly and clearly. I left Denver with the clothes I came with and the money I had earned, and nothing that belonged to him. What I took and what he cannot forgive is a conversation I overheard that I was not supposed to hear, and what I know because of that conversation. What did you hear? She pulled out a chair and sat down because the story was not short, and she was tired of carrying it standing up. Vance runs a land acquisition company, she said. He calls it investment. What it actually is fraud. He identifies properties with disputed titles or unclear water rights manufactures. Additional legal complications through contacts he has in county. Clerk offices drives the owners off through financial pressure or reputation damage or both, then acquires the properties at collapse prices and resells them to development interests in the East. She paused. I worked as his bookkeeper for 8 months. I was good at my job, and he trusted me more than he should have. And one afternoon I came back to the office early from an errand and heard him giving very specific instructions to a man I didn't recognize about how to file false documents in 3 different counties. Another pause. He didn't know I heard. I finished the workday. I went home. And the next morning, I left Denver. Jake was quiet for a moment. Did you take anything with you, documents, records? She looked at him steadily. I took nothing. Nothing at all. Nothing. Because if I had taken something, he could have had me arrested for theft, and that would have been the end of everything. So you have no proof. Just what you heard. What I heard and what I remember, and 3 years of watching him follow me from city to city, making sure no one will ever listen to what I remember. She folded her hands on the table. He doesn't want me silenced exactly. He wants me discredited. A silenced woman is a martyr. A discredited woman is just another sad story people shake their heads at. Jake sat down across from her. He put both forearms on the table and looked at her with those gray eyes that had a way of being direct without being aggressive, and he said, You came here knowing he would find you eventually. I came here because I ran out of places to go that were farther away. She said it without self-pity, just as a fact. Caldwell was the end of the road. I got off that stage because there was no more stage. And Pratt found you within 20 minutes. Yes, and you refused him anyway. I have made a habit, Lillian said carefully, of refusing men who think they already own me before we've been introduced. Something shifted in Jake's expression. Not the almost smile this time, something more serious than that. I need you to tell me everything you remember, he said. Every name, every county, every detail from those 8 months. She looked at him. Why? Because you said you have no proof. He leaned forward slightly. But memory is not the only kind of evidence. And Vance is coming here, which means he's going to walk into a situation he thinks he controls. He paused. I would like to make sure he doesn't. Lillian studied him across the table, this man who filed papers before conversations, who thought about most things before he did them, who had a mother, who made practical marriages and called it sense. You already have something, she said slowly. You already started something before I told you any of this. He didn't deny it. The water rights, she said. The filings you mentioned at the county clerk. You've been building something. I've been protecting what's mine, he said. Now I'm trying to understand what else needs protecting. She was quiet for a moment. Then she started talking, and she did not stop for a long time. Cal Briggs turned out to be the first real surprise. Lillian had categorized him early as a man who kept his distance from complications he hadn't been hired to handle. He did his work, he watched, he kept his observations to himself. She had respected that, without expecting anything more from it. On the 4th morning after the letter arrived, she was in the kitchen before dawn. She had always been an early riser, and the habit was impossible to break, and Cal came in through the back door without knocking, which he had never done before. He put a piece of paper on the kitchen table. He poured himself coffee without asking. He sat down. What is that? She said. Names, he said. 3 ranchers in 2 counties who lost their land in the last 4 years under circumstances that looked like bad luck, but smelled like something else. He picked up his cup. I grew up in this territory. I know people. When Jake told me what you'd told him about Vance's operation, I wrote some letters. She looked at him. Jake told you. Jake tells me what I need to know to be useful. Cal set his cup down. You got a problem with that. She thought about it honestly. No, she said. I suppose I don't. Good. He tapped the paper. 2 of those 3 ranchers still have family in the area. One of them has a widow who kept every document her husband ever touched because she always suspected the title dispute that drove them off was manufactured. She kept them in a box in her sister's cellar because she didn't trust her own house not to be searched. Lillian stared at him. She kept documents, she said. She's a careful woman, Cal said. Reminded me of someone. Can she be reached? I already reached her. He finished his coffee and stood up. She wants to meet you. Mog. The widow's name was Agnes Croft, and she drove herself to the Walker Ranch in a wagon she handled with the ease of someone who had done it 10,000 times. And she arrived on a Tuesday morning and sat across from Lillian at the same kitchen table where everything seemed to get decided, and she put a wooden box on the table between them. She was somewhere in her 60s with white hair pinned back severely and hands that had done field work and probably always would. She looked at Lillian with eyes that were sharp and not particularly warm and said, Cal says you worked for Howard Vance. For 8 months, Lillian said, as his bookkeeper. Do you know a man named Albert Reese? Lillian thought. Reese. He came to the office twice. I recorded payments to him in the ledger. He was listed as a surveying consultant. Agnes Croft's eyes went very still. Albert Reese was the deputy clerk in Harmon County 4 years ago. He processed the title filing that took my husband's land. She opened the box. And here is the original deed, which shows a recording date 3 weeks before the date on the county's official copy. Which means someone changed the official date, which means the filing was fraudulent. Lillian looked at this document. She recognized the structure of it, the format, the language, the particular way the legal description was worded, because she had seen versions of it in Vance's files. She had recorded payments and never understood what they were for, and now, looking at Agnes Croft's original deed, she understood. He was running this in multiple counties simultaneously, Lillian said. Yes. And he used different names for the clerks he was paying. Albert Reese in Harmon County. I don't know the others. I do, Lillian said. I have them in my memory from 8 months of recording payments to men listed as consultants. She looked up from the document. Mrs. Croft, I need to know if you would be willing to appear at a legal proceeding with these documents. Agnes Croft looked at her for a long time. My husband worked that land for 22 years, she said. He died 2 winters after we lost it. I believe losing it is what killed him, though I can't prove that either. She closed her hands on the edge of the table. Yes, Mrs. Walker. I will appear at any proceeding you can arrange. Jake heard all of it that evening, and he listened without interrupting, which Lillian had come to understand was his version of urgency. The more important something was, the stiller he got while absorbing it. When she finished, he said, Reese. Albert Reese, Harmon County Deputy Clerk 4 years ago. I know the name, Jake said. Reese has a brother-in-law in Caldwell. They're not close. Had a falling out. He paused. The brother-in-law's name is Tom Aldrich. Lillian blinked. Aldrich, as in Mrs. Aldrich's husband, yes. She sat back. The woman who runs the boarding house, whose cousin wrote the letter, whose husband has a brother-in-law who committed document fraud for Howard Vance. This town is small, Jake said. Everything connects to everything else if you pull on it long enough. Would Tom Aldrich talk? Tom Aldrich has hated Albert Reese for 6 years. The falling out was over money Reese borrowed and never returned. Jake was quiet for a moment. I think if someone asked Tom Aldrich the right questions at the right moment, he might remember some things that would be very inconvenient for Howard Vance. Lillian felt something shift in her chest, not quite hope, which was a thing she had learned to be careful with, but something adjacent to it. Something that felt like the first solid ground after a long time in mud. Jake, she said, how much of this did you know before Pratt came to the ranch? A pause. Some of it, he said honestly. How much? I knew Vance's name. I knew he operated in Denver and that he'd moved operations east. I knew someone had been manufacturing title complications in 2 counties west of here, and that Pratt had been the beneficiary of at least 3 of those situations. He looked at her directly. I didn't know you had 8 months of recorded payments in your memory. That changes the shape of things considerably. She stared at him. You knew about Vance before I came to Caldwell. I knew about an operation that had Vance's fingerprints on it. I didn't connect it to a woman on a morning stage from Cheyenne until you told me what you'd left behind in Denver. The silence that followed was not comfortable. You offered me this arrangement, she said slowly. Knowing that I might have information you needed, I offered you this arrangement because you needed ground to stand on, and I needed a different kind of protection than money could buy. His voice was even. Those 2 things are both true. The information is additional. That is a very careful way of saying you may have had more than one reason for what you did. I generally do, he said. So do most people. Lillian looked at him across the table. This man who was honest in ways that were sometimes harder to absorb than dishonesty, and she understood that she was angry and that the anger was not entirely fair and that she needed to sit with both of those facts before she said anything else. I'm going to need a moment, she said. Take what you need, he said, and left the kitchen, and she sat alone at the table for a long time. Call. She was not gone in the morning. She had considered it somewhere around 2 in the morning, with the practical part of her brain that had always been the loudest voice, the part that calculated risk and exposure and the cost of trusting people who had hidden reasons. She had waited. And then she had thought about Agnes Croft's box of documents, about Albert Reese's name in her own memory, alongside 5 other names she could still produce without effort, about Gerald Pratt riding up the ranch road with 2 men behind him, and that flat, certain expression of a man who had never in his life been refused anything he truly wanted. She thought about 37 cents and a broken bag latch and a town that shut its doors before she put her foot down. And she thought about Jake Walker standing in the yard saying he made a very serious mistake picking someone on my land to go after. She stayed. When Jake came into the kitchen in the morning and found her at the stove, he stopped in the doorway. She didn't look at him. I'm still angry, she said. All right. But I'm also still here. I can see that. If you have other things you haven't told me, she said, I would prefer to know them now rather than discover them later. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, I wrote to an attorney in Cheyenne 3 weeks ago. His name is Franklin Cord. He handles land fraud cases. I told him I had a witness with first-hand knowledge of a document fraud operation in multiple counties and asked what kind of legal proceeding might be possible. She turned around. 3 weeks ago, she said. You wrote to an attorney 3 weeks ago, before Pratt came to the ranch. Before Pratt came to the ranch. Before you had spoken to me about any of this. Yes. She stared at him. You were already building a case. I was building a foundation, he said. I didn't know what I'd be putting on top of it. And now? Now I know. He met her eyes. Cord wrote back. He believes a formal complaint can be filed with territorial authorities. He needs sworn statements, documentary evidence, and at least one witness willing to testify in a public proceeding. Agnes Croft will testify. I know. I need you to testify as well. The word landed in her stomach like a stone dropped into still water, and the ripples went a long way out. Vance will destroy me on that stand, she said. That's what he does. That's what he has spent 3 years preparing to do. He has spent 3 years preparing to destroy Lillian Hayes alone, Jake said. He hasn't met Lillian Walker with documented evidence, a land fraud attorney from Cheyenne and Agnes Croft's wooden box. She was quiet. He's coming here anyway, Jake said. The question is whether he arrives to find a woman he can dismantle or a case he cannot. She turned back to the stove because she needed somewhere to put her hands. When does Cord arrive? She said. 2 weeks. And Vance? Based on the letter, 10 days at the outside. She nodded once. Then we have a great deal of work to do. The work was not dramatic. It was the opposite of dramatic. It was the grinding, careful, exhausting work of reconstruction. Lillian sat at the kitchen table for hours each day with paper and a pen and pulled every name from her memory that she had ever recorded in Howard Vance's ledgers. Every payment, every date, every county listed beside every name. She wrote it all out in the precise, orderly hand she had developed in 8 months of professional bookkeeping, and the result was 11 pages of documented memory that was not proof, but was the architecture on which proof could be built. Cal Briggs drove to 3 different towns in 6 days and came back each time with additional pieces. A rancher in Benton County who had lost his grazing rights under circumstances that matched the pattern exactly. A former county clerk's assistant in a neighboring district who had been fired 2 years ago for asking inconvenient questions and had kept out of sheer stubbornness a copy of the document that had gotten her fired. A retired judge in Laramie who had ruled against Vance in a case 2 years prior and had been living with the knowledge that his ruling had somehow been reversed on appeal through channels he had never understood. The shape of Vance's operation was emerging from the dark, the way the outline of a landscape emerges when the sun comes up slowly and then all at once. And then on the 8th day, Denny came riding up to the house at a run and pulled his horse to a stop outside the porch and called out, "Jake! There's a man asking for Mrs. Walker at the post office in town." Everything went still. Lillian was on the porch. Jake came out of the barn. "What man?" Jake said. Denny looked uncomfortable in the way people look when they have information they don't want to deliver. "Gave his name as Vance," he said. "Howard Vance. From Denver." He was 2 days early. Lillian stood on the porch of Walker Ranch and felt the thing she had been outrunning for 3 years finally close the distance, and for one full breath, she let herself feel the full weight of it, the fear, the exhaustion, the old familiar pull toward disappearing before the damage could begin. Then she let that breath go. "Tell me what he looked like," she said to Denny. Denny blinked. "Ma'am, what did he look like? What was he wearing? Was he alone, or did he have someone with him?" He had one man with him, big fellow. Vance himself is maybe 50 well-dressed gray at the temples. Spoke polite, smiled a lot." "Yes," Lillian said. "He always does." She looked at Jake. "He came early to catch us off balance," she said. "He wants to see the ranch before we're ready. He wants to see me before I've had time to prepare." "Then we don't let him come to the ranch," Jake said. "He'll come anyway." "Not today he won't." Jake looked at Denny. "Ride back to town. Tell Pratt's man at the livery. Yes, Pratt has a man at the livery. Don't look surprised. Tell him that Jake Walker knows Vance is in town and wants it known that any man who shows up at Walker Ranch without an invitation can expect to be met at the fence line." Denny nodded and turned his horse. "And Denny," Jake added. "Stop by Tom Aldrich's place on the way back. Tell him I need to see him tonight." When Denny was gone, Jake turned to Lillian. 10 pages of memory," he said. "Agnes Croft's documents. A retired judge in Laramie. A fired clerk's assistant. And Tom Aldrich, who has 6 years of grievance against Albert Reese." He paused. "Vance came early because he thinks he's ahead of us." "He's not ahead of us," she said. "No," Jake said. "He's not." He looked at her steadily. "Are you ready?" Lillian Hayes, who had come to Caldwell with 37 cents and a broken latch and run clean out of places to go, looked at the road where Denny had just ridden and felt something settle in her spine that had not been there in 3 years. Not bravery exactly. Something harder than bravery. The particular steel that forms in a person who has been running long enough to remember what it felt like to stand still. "I've been ready," she said, "for a very long time." Howard Vance did not come to the ranch that first night. He came the next morning at 8 o'clock alone, without his large companion, without advance warning, without the social pretense of sending a note ahead. He simply appeared at the fence gate on a rented horse dressed in a gray suit that was too fine for ranch country, and called out in the pleasant carrying voice of a man accustomed to being received. Jake was already outside. Cal was somewhere behind the barn. Lillian was in the kitchen, and she heard the voice before she heard the words, and her hands went still on the counter for exactly 3 seconds before she made herself move. She came to the porch doorway and stood there without going further, and she looked at Howard Vance across the distance of the yard, and he looked at her, and the years collapsed between them like a poorly built fence in a hard wind. He looked exactly the same. That was the thing about men like Vance. They didn't change because they never absorbed consequences long enough for consequences to mark them. Same gray at the temples, same easy posture, same smile that arrived just slightly before anything else on his face, as if it were a door he opened to keep people from seeing what was behind it. "Lillian," he said, and his voice was warm with something that sounded, if you didn't know better, like genuine relief. "Thank God. I've been so worried about you." Jake looked at him the way Jake looked at everything that required his attention completely, without expression, without hurry. "Mr. Vance," he said, "my wife isn't expecting visitors this morning." Of course, of course." Vance swung down from the horse with practiced ease. "I apologize for the hour, Mr. Walker. I've come a long way, and I'm afraid my concern for Lillian's well-being outweighed my manners." He tied the horse at the fence and rested his hands on the top rail and looked at Jake with the expression of a reasonable man appealing to another reasonable man. "You should know, and I say this with great reluctance, that Lillian has had some difficulties. Episodes of confusion. She has a tendency to place herself in situations that she later misremembers. I was her employer in Denver, and when she left under troubling circumstances, I felt responsible. She had no family, no one to look after her properly." Jake said nothing. Vance waited for the silence to do its work, which was the technique of a man who had used silence as a weapon before. Let the words land, let the doubt take root, let the listener fill the gap with their own uncertainty. Jake gave him nothing to work with. "Mr. Vance," Jake said finally, "are you calling my wife unstable?" "I'm calling her vulnerable," Vance said smoothly, "which is not the same thing. A vulnerable woman can be exploited by people who recognize her condition. I would hate to think—" "She told me about Denver," Jake said. Vance paused for a fraction of a second. "Did she?" "She told me everything." Jake's voice was the same temperature it always was. "About the bookkeeping, about the payments, about what she heard in the office that afternoon." He paused. "About Albert Reese." The name hit Vance the way a name will hit a man who thought it was buried. His smile held, but the thing behind it shifted something quick and involuntary that was gone almost before it appeared. "I don't know what she's told you," Vance said, and his voice had dropped slightly in register. "But Lillian has a history of constructing narratives that serve her—" "Come inside," Jake said. "Have coffee. Let's talk about it properly." Vance studied him. The invitation was unexpected. He had come prepared for a defensive husband for a closed door for suspicion he could work around. An open door was harder to manage. "I appreciate the hospitality," he said carefully. "It's not hospitality," Jake said. "It's a conversation." Lillian moved back from the doorway before they came in. She was at the table when they entered, seated, hands folded, 11 pages of documented memory, face down on the chair beside her where Vance couldn't see them. She had arranged herself deliberately, and the deliberateness was itself a message. She was not surprised, she was not afraid, she was not the woman he had chased across 3 states. Vance looked at her, and she looked back at him, and the room was very quiet. "Lillian," he said in that warm, regretful tone, "I wish you'd come to me when you were in trouble, instead of running." "I wasn't in trouble when I left Denver," she said. "I was in danger. Those are different things." "Danger." He sat down across from her uninvited. "From me." "From you." "That's a serious accusation." "It's an accurate one." He shook his head slowly, the way a man shakes his head when confronted with a child saying something impossible. "You heard a private conversation that you didn't have the context to understand, and you built an entire story around it. I understand that. I was never angry with you for it. I was worried. I am still worried." "Albert Reese," she said. His expression didn't crack this time. He had recalibrated since the fence line. "A surveying consultant," he said. "I've used many. I don't see the relevance." "He was the deputy clerk in Harmon County," she said. 4 years ago." He processed a title filing with a forged recording date that resulted in a family losing land they'd held for 22 years. That is a remarkable story, Vance said. Do you have any evidence of that, or only the word of a woman who admittedly overheard half a conversation and has been by her own account running from the consequences ever since? I have his name in a payment ledger, she said. In my handwriting. In a ledger I kept for 8 months. A ledger you no longer possess. No. But I possess the memory of every entry in it, and I wrote them all out last week. 11 pages. She kept her hands folded. Names, dates, counties, amounts. Would you like to tell me which ones are wrong? Vance looked at her for a long moment. The smile had gone entirely now. What was under it was not anger, it was something colder than anger, the flat assessment of a man recalculating odds. You found someone to listen to you, he said. Good for you, but a woman's memory of a ledger she no longer has is not evidence. It's testimony, and testimony requires credibility, Lillian, which is something you've had a great deal of difficulty maintaining. Mrs. Croft has her original deed, Lillian said, with the original recording date, which does not match the county's official copy. Silence. And Tom Aldrich, she continued, remembers a conversation with his brother-in-law Albert Reese approximately 5 years ago in which Reese described being paid to alter official documents for a land acquisition company operating out of Denver. She paused. He's prepared to swear to that in a legal proceeding. Howard Vance sat very still. Outside somewhere, Cal Briggs was doing whatever Cal Briggs did, moving quietly, and saying nothing, and being precisely where he needed to be. The morning was going on around them, ordinary and different. You've been busy, Vance said, and his voice had changed again. Not warm anymore, not cold exactly. Something in between that was more honest than either. I've been preparing, she said. There's a difference. He looked at Jake, who had been standing in the kitchen doorway the entire time without speaking. Mr. Walker, he said. Whatever she's told you, whatever she's shown you, you should understand that you are involving yourself in something considerably larger than a domestic dispute. Gerald Pratt is a powerful man in this territory. The interest behind the operations you're apparently attempting to expose have reach that extends far beyond Caldwell County. I am genuinely offering you the opportunity to step away from this before it becomes a problem you cannot manage. Jake looked at him for a moment. Are you threatening me in my own kitchen? He said. I'm advising you, Vance said carefully. Same thing. Jake pushed off the doorframe. I think we're done here. I'll walk you to your horse. It was not a suggestion. Vance left. He rode back toward Caldwell without looking back, which told Lillian more than if he'd looked back. A man who looks back is still uncertain. A man who doesn't has already shifted to his next move. He's going to Pratt, she said when Jake came back inside. Yes. They'll consolidate. Pratt has local power. Vance has the larger network. Together they'll try to move the legal proceeding out of this county to somewhere they have more influence. Cord gets here in 4 days, Jake said. Vance knows about Cord. He'll find out. He has the same sources Pratt has, the hotel clerk, the livery Mrs. Aldrich's cousin. Jake sat down at the table for the first time that morning. He looked tired in a way he hadn't let show before, not defeated but carrying. I need to ask you something. Ask? Is there anything else? Anything you haven't told me because you thought it would change what I was willing to do? She looked at him. The question was direct, and deserved a direct answer. Vance has a wife, she said. Margaret Vance. She has been married to him for 11 years. She knows what he does, not every detail, but the shape of it. She has covered for him, smoothed things over, managed the social surface. Lillian paused. She was kind to me once, when I first came to work for him. She had me to tea and talked to me about Denver, like a woman talking to another woman without agenda. She paused again. I think she is not entirely at peace with the life she has chosen. Jake was very still. Where is she? He said. I don't know. She was in Denver when I left. Whether she traveled with him? Denny. Jake called toward the door. Denny appeared from the porch with the immediacy of someone who had been stationed within hearing distance. Go to the hotel in town, Jake said. Quietly. Find out if Vance registered 1 room or 2. Find out if there's a woman with him. Denny was gone before Jake finished the sentence. Margaret Vance was at the Caldwell Hotel. She had taken a separate room from her husband, which the hotel clerk found unusual enough to mention to Denny without being asked. She had arrived the previous evening on a different horse, had eaten alone in her room, and had not spoken to anyone except to ask if there was a doctor in town. When Denny reported this, Lillian sat with it for a long moment. "She's not here because Howard brought her," she said. "She's here because she followed him." "Why would she follow him?" Jake said. "Because she's done something, or she's about to do something, and she didn't want to do it alone." Lillian stood up. "I need to go into town." "Lily." "She asked for a doctor. She's not hurt. Vance doesn't operate that way. She's frightened, or she's finished with being frightened, which is a different kind of need, but looks the same from the outside." She was already moving toward the door. "I know what it looks like when a woman has run out of reasons to stay silent." Jake stood. "I'm coming with you." "I know you are," she said. "But let me go in first. Alone." She looked at him. "She won't talk with a man in the room. Not about this. Not about him." He held her gaze for a moment. Then he nodded. Margaret Vance opened the hotel room door on the second knock, and Lillian understood immediately that the woman had been expecting someone, had been sitting in that room, expecting someone to come prepared for the knock. The way you prepare for something you have both dreaded and desperately wanted. She looked older than Lillian remembered. Not old, she was perhaps 45, but the kind of aged that comes from sustained internal effort, from holding a shape that doesn't fit. "Lillian," she said. "Margaret." They looked at each other in the doorway, the way women sometimes look at each other across the distance of a shared experience that was never spoken aloud. "You should come in," Margaret said. Lillian came in. She sat in the chair by the window. Margaret sat on the edge of the bed and folded her hands in her lap and looked at them. "He told me you'd surfaced," she said. "He told me you'd made some kind of arrangement with a rancher. He said you were trying to make trouble with old stories that had no proof behind them." She looked up. "He said he was coming here to manage it." "He came to the ranch this morning," Lillian said. "He was very composed." "He's always composed." Something moved through Margaret's face. Not bitterness exactly, but the exhaustion of someone who has lived alongside a performance long enough to have memorized every line. "I didn't come here because Howard asked me to. I came because—" She stopped, started again. "There was a woman in Laramie, 2 years ago. Howard did to her what he did to you, worse in some ways. She had a daughter." She stopped again. "The daughter is 11 now." Lillian waited. "I kept things," Margaret said quietly. "Over the years, I told myself I was keeping them for, I don't know what I told myself. Safety. Evidence of my own sanity, perhaps. Documentation that what I was living through was real and not something I had imagined." She reached under the mattress, the gesture of a woman who has learned not to keep important things where they can be easily found, and produced a folded envelope. "These are letters, in Howard's handwriting, to Albert Reese and to 2 other men whose names I believe you know, Lillian, because you wrote their payments in that ledger." Lillian looked at the envelope. "Margaret," she said carefully, "do you understand what this is?" "It's the end of my marriage," Margaret said. "I understood that when I packed it." Her voice was steady in the way that things are steady when they have passed through trembling and come out the other side. "I also understand that it's evidence. Real evidence. Not memory. Not testimony from a discredited woman. Letters in my husband's handwriting making explicit arrangements to commit document fraud in multiple counties." She held the envelope out. "I want it to be used." Lillian took the envelope. She held it without opening it. "You'll have to testify," she said, "about where you got these, about how long you've had them, about what you know." "I know." "He will not forgive it." "There's nothing left to forgive," Margaret said. "He used it all up." Lillian came back to the wagon where Jake was waiting with the envelope in her hand, and she got up onto the seat and sat down and held the envelope in her lap, and for a moment she didn't say anything at all. Jake looked at the envelope. He looked at her face. "Letters," she said. "In Vance's handwriting, to Reese and 2 others. Explicit instructions. She looked at Jake. Margaret kept them for years. She followed him here to hand them over. Jake was quiet for a moment. This changes the shape of the case, he said. It doesn't change the case, she said. It ends it. This is what Cord needs. This is what finishes it. She sat there in the wagon on the main street of Caldwell, with 11 years of another woman's endurance in an envelope on her lap. And she felt the weight of it, not triumph, not relief, exactly something more complicated. The particular gravity of a moment when everything that has been building finally becomes real. There's something else, she said. Jake waited. Vance threatened you this morning, in your kitchen. He told you the interests behind this have reached beyond Caldwell County. She turned to look at him directly. He wasn't lying about that. This is bigger than Pratt, bigger than one county. When we file with territorial authorities, when this goes to a formal hearing, the people behind Vance's operation will know who brought it forward. Yes, Jake said. That's dangerous. Yes. You knew that before this morning. Yes. She looked at him. Why are you doing this? He was quiet for a moment, not avoiding the question, but giving it the honest weight it deserved. Because it's right, he said. Because Agnes Croft's husband worked that land for 22 years and died in a rented room 2 winters after losing it. Because there's a woman in Laramie with an 11-year-old daughter who deserved better than what Vance gave her. Because Pratt has been bleeding this county for 4 years and nobody with enough standing to stop him has been willing to stand. He paused. And because you showed up in this town with 37 cents and a broken bag and refused a powerful man to his face on Main Street, and I thought that kind of person deserves someone in their corner. Lillian Hayes sat in the wagon and looked at Jake Walker, and felt something move through her that was not strategy, not calculation, not the careful management of a temporary arrangement. Jake, she said very quietly. I know, he said. Just that. I know. She looked away down the street. We should get back. Cord arrives in 4 days, and we have a great deal to prepare. Yes. Neither of them moved for another moment. Then Jake picked up the reins, and the wagon started moving, and Lillian held the envelope carefully in both hands, and the road to Walker Ranch stretched out ahead of them in the morning light. That night, long after supper, long after Cal had gone to the bunkhouse and Denny had turned in, Lillian came to the doorway of the main room where Jake was going over papers at the table. She stood there for a moment. He looked up. I need to tell you something, she said. About Denver. The whole of it, not the facts of it, which you already have. The what it was like, what it cost. She stopped. I've never told anyone the whole of it. I kept it because I thought if I said it aloud, it would become more real than I could manage. Jake set down his pen. You don't have to, he said. I know I don't have to. She came and sat down across from him. I want to. I want you to know it before we walk into that hearing room, because if it comes out there, and Vance will try to make it come out there, I don't want the first time you hear it to be in front of a judge. He folded his hands and looked at her and waited, and Lillian told him. All of it. Not the efficient version she had given him before the facts arranged for usefulness, but the real version. What it had felt like to hear Vance's voice in that office and understand all at once what she had been employed to enable. What it had felt like to go home that night and pack a single bag and know that the life she had built in Denver was finished before morning. What the first month of running had been like, the hunger, the doubt, the mornings when she had nearly gone back because the alternative was so much harder than she had prepared for. What Vance had done to her name in Denver, the specific shape of it, the woman who had been her friend, who stopped speaking to her, the boarding house that had asked her to leave, the letter she had written to a former employer asking for a reference, and the silence that had come back instead. What 3 years of being a woman that a skilled liar had pre-discredited felt like from the inside. Jake did not interrupt. He did not reach across the table, did not make sounds of comfort, did not perform sympathy. He listened the way someone listens when they understand that listening is the only thing required of them. When she finished, the room was quiet. He said, How long did you go without anyone believing you? 3 years, she said. Until Agnes Croft. And before that, in Denver. Did anyone? No. The word was flat and complete. No one. He looked at her for a long moment. "You're not facing him alone anymore," he said. It was a simple sentence. It was not poetry. It was not a declaration of anything beyond its own plain meaning, and perhaps for that reason, precisely for that reason, it was the sentence that finally broke through the 3 years of careful management and arrived somewhere real inside her. She did not cry. She was not that kind of woman, and this was not that kind of moment. But something in her face changed, something loosened that had been held rigid for a very long time, and Jake Walker saw it, and he didn't say anything about it, which was exactly right. "All right," she said after a moment. "All right," he agreed. Outside, the Wyoming night went on indifferent and enormous and full of stars. Inside Walker Ranch, two people who had begun as a strategy sat across from each other at a kitchen table and understood without saying so that the arrangement had become something neither of them had planned for. 4 days until Cord arrived. 4 days until the shape of everything shifted again. Vance was already in Caldwell, already meeting with Pratt, already building the counterattack. Lillian knew how he worked. He would be moving fast now, shoring up testimony, calling in contacts, finding angles she hadn't anticipated. But he did not know about Margaret's letters. And that was the one thing he could not prepare for, because it was the one thing he believed was safely buried. It was not buried. It was in an envelope on the table at Walker Ranch, and in 4 days it would be in the hands of Franklin Cord, and Howard Vance was walking toward a hearing room he thought he controlled without knowing the floor had already been taken out from under him. Lillian put her hand flat on the envelope. "Get some rest," Jake said. "Tomorrow is going to be a long day." "They've all been long days," she said. "Yes," he said. "But this one's the last long one before the tide turns." She looked at him. She almost said something. Then she picked up the envelope and went to bed, and the bolt on the inside of her door slid home behind her, and Jake Walker sat at the table alone for a long time in the dark. Franklin Cord arrived on a Thursday 2 hours before noon on a horse that looked like it had been ridden hard from Cheyenne, and didn't appreciate it. He was younger than Lillian had expected, somewhere around 35, with a lean, precise quality to the way he moved and talked, as if he had learned early that words were expensive and had been careful with them ever since. He shook Jake's hand, nodded to Cal, and then turned to Lillian and looked at her with the direct, evaluating attention of a man who needed to know immediately whether his witness was going to hold. "You're Mrs. Walker," he said. "I am. You worked as Howard Vance's bookkeeper for 8 months in Denver." "Yes." "You heard him give explicit instructions to a man you later identified as Albert Reese regarding the falsification of official documents." "Yes." "And you produced 11 pages of documented memory from that period." "On the table inside," she said. "Along with something else." She told him about Margaret's letters while they were still standing in the yard, because she wanted to see his face when he heard it without him having time to compose a professional response. His expression went through 3 distinct phases: careful neutrality, controlled surprise, and then something that looked very much like a man who had just understood that a case he thought was difficult had become something else entirely. "Letters," he said. "In Vance's own handwriting. To Reese and 2 others. Explicit instructions. Margaret Vance has agreed to testify to their provenance." Cord looked at Jake. "You said you had a witness with first-hand knowledge." "I did," Jake said. "You didn't say you had the defendant's wife." "I didn't know that part yet when I wrote to you." Cord was quiet for a moment, absorbing. Then, "Where are the letters now?" "Inside," Lillian said. "Locked." He nodded once. "All right, show me everything. We have 3 days before I can get a hearing scheduled, and I want to spend all 3 of them making sure nothing surprises us in that room." The 3 days were the hardest of all of them, which was saying something. Cord worked the way surgeons work, without sentiment, without distraction, with a precision that left no room for anything that wasn't strictly necessary. He went through Lillian's 11 pages, line by line, asking her to reconstruct not just the facts, but the context, which payments came in clusters, which names appeared most frequently, which counties had the highest concentration of activity. He cross-referenced with Agnes Croft's documents and with the statements Cal had gathered from the ranchers in Benton County, building a structure that was not dependent on any single piece, but instead interlocked everything so that removing one piece would not bring the rest down. On the second day, he interviewed Margaret Vance at the hotel in town. He came back looking like a man who had heard things he would not easily set aside. "She's credible," he told Lillian that evening. "She's frightened, but she's not uncertain. That combination is actually very effective in front of a judge." "She's been certain for a long time," Lillian said. "She just hadn't been ready." What made her ready? Lillian thought about it honestly. "I think she was waiting to see if anyone else would stand up first," she said. "I think she needed to know she wasn't the only one before she could be one of them." Cord looked at her. "That's true of most witnesses." On the third day, Tom Aldrich came to the ranch. He was a heavy-set man in his 50s, with the compressed energy of someone who had been carrying a specific grievance for so long it had become structural. He sat across from Cord at the kitchen table and told his story about Albert Reese in a flat, factual voice that did not waver once, and when he finished he said, "I knew what Reese was doing was wrong. I should have said so 5 years ago. I didn't, because I didn't think anyone would listen." "They'll listen now," Cord said. Aldrich looked at Lillian. "Mrs. Walker, I want you to know my wife told Pratt about you when you first came to town. She told him you'd arrived on the morning stage. She thought she was doing what was expected." He stopped. "She didn't know what he'd do with it." "I know," Lillian said. "She feels terrible about it." "Tell her it's all right," Lillian said. "Tell her the ending is going to be different than the beginning." Phone. The night before the hearing, Pratt made his final move. Cal came in at 9 in the evening, carrying the particular expression of a man delivering news he wishes he didn't have, and he told Jake that 2 of the 3 Benton County ranchers who had agreed to provide statements had withdrawn. Word had reached them through intermediaries, through pressure applied at the level of bank loans and grazing agreements, and the kind of quiet economic suffocation that left no visible marks that their participation would have consequences. Jake stood in the middle of the room and absorbed this without expression. "Which 2?" he said. "Morrison and Bell," Cal said. "Hadley's still in. He said Pratt's man came to see him this morning, and he told him to get off his property." "Good man," Jake said. "It's still a blow," Cord said from the table where he'd been working. Morrison had the clearest documentation of the 4. "How does it change the case?" Lillian asked. "It weakens the county-level pattern evidence," Cord said. "It doesn't touch the core. Margaret's letters, your testimony, Agnes Croft's deed, Aldrich on Reese. But it gives Pratt's attorney room to argue the pattern is isolated rather than systematic." He paused. "It's what I'd do in his position." "Can we get Morrison back?" Jake said. "Not by tomorrow," Cord said. The room was quiet. Then Lillian said, "What about the retired judge? The one in Laramie who ruled against Vance and had his ruling reversed on appeal?" Cord looked at her. "Judge Harlan. He's 80 miles away. Can he submit a written statement?" "A sworn affidavit, if it can be executed before morning, yes. It could be admitted." Jake was already looking at Cal. "I need the fastest horse we have," Cal said before Jake spoke. "And a fresh one waiting in Laramie for the ride back." "Take Denny with you," Jake said. 2 riders relay the horses." Cal had his hat on before Jake finished the sentence, and the sound of hoofbeats disappeared into the Wyoming night within 5 minutes, and Cord looked at Jake with an expression that was as close to impressed as a man of his particular economy allowed himself to get. "You keep a prepared operation," Cord said. "I try to think about most things before I do them," Jake said. The hearing was scheduled for 10 in the morning at Caldwell Town Hall before the Honorable Judge Elias Crane, who had ridden in from the territorial circuit the previous evening, and was by all accounts a man who did not like his time wasted and did not like Gerald Pratt, a sentiment he was careful not to express publicly, but which was apparent to anyone who had watched him work. Gerald Pratt arrived at the town hall at 9:45 with 2 attorneys and the confidence of a man who had attended every significant proceeding in this county for 15 years and won every single one. He was dressed carefully, spoke to people in the room by name, and projected the ease of a man on home ground. Howard Vance arrived separately, which was noted. He sat on the opposite side of the room from Pratt, close enough to coordinate far enough to signal that they were presenting as independent parties rather than a unified front. It was a legal strategy. It was also the first sign to anyone reading the room carefully that they were worried. Margaret Vance sat in the row directly behind Lillian and Jake, and she did not look at her husband. Lillian felt the weight of every person in that room, the watching, the measuring, the anticipation of people who had been living under Pratt's arrangements for so long that the possibility of a different outcome had not yet become something they allowed themselves to believe in. She felt it, and she let it settle, rather than fighting it, because the weight of witnesses was not a burden. It was a responsibility, and responsibility she understood. Jake was beside her. His arm was not around her. His hand was not on hers. He was simply present in the way that he was always present, completely without performance, without the need to demonstrate anything. It was enough. It was, in fact, exactly enough. Judge Crane called the room to order at 10 o'clock precisely, and began with the formal recitation of the complaint, which Cord had filed under territorial fraud statutes, covering document falsification, corruption of official proceedings, and coordinated conspiracy to deprive landowners of legal property rights. The language was formal and layered, and Lillian had memorized every word of it. Pratt's lead attorney, a man named Cavendish, who had ridden up from Cheyenne with a leather case full of prepared objections, stood immediately and moved to have the complaint dismissed on grounds of insufficient evidence and lack of jurisdiction. Judge Crane looked at him over his glasses. "Sit down, Mr. Cavendish," he said. "I'll tell you when there's insufficient evidence after I've heard the evidence." Cavendish sat. Cord opened with Agnes Croft. Agnes Croft walked to the front of that room the way a woman walks when she has been waiting 4 years for the chance and is not going to waste it. She sat in the witness chair and put her wooden box on her lap and answered Cord's questions in a voice that did not tremble once. And when Cord asked her to produce the original deed and explain the discrepancy in recording dates, she opened the box and handed the document forward with the calm of someone performing a task they have rehearsed 10,000 times in their head. Cavendish cross-examined her for 20 minutes and made no visible progress. Agnes Croft had spent 4 years with those documents. She knew them better than he did, and every time he tried to introduce uncertainty about the recording date discrepancy, she corrected him with a specificity that left the correction hanging in the room long after he'd moved on. When she stepped down, Lillian heard someone in the row behind her exhale. Then Cord called Tom Aldrich. Aldrich was less composed than Agnes Croft. He was nervous, which showed, and Cavendish tried to use that nervousness to imply uncertainty about his recollection of the conversation with Reese. But the thing about Tom Aldrich was that his anger was entirely genuine, and genuine anger has a texture that manufactured doubt cannot erode. He remembered that conversation with Reese because he had replayed it in his head for 5 years, wondering what he should have done with it, and the repetition had carved it into him. "He told me he'd been paid to change a recording date on a county document," Aldrich said. "He was drunk. He thought it was funny. He said—" Aldrich paused, and something crossed his face. "He said nobody ever checks the dates. He said the owners just give up and go." The room was quiet in a particular way. "Nobody ever checks the dates," Judge Crane repeated from the bench. "Yes, sir," Aldrich said. "That's what he said." The mid-morning break was the moment Vance made his move, and Lillian had expected it would be then when Cord's opening witnesses had landed, but before the documentary evidence was entered in the narrow window where a private conversation could still change the shape of things. Vance approached her in the hallway outside the town hall with the smooth, unhurried movement of a man who was still performing confidence he no longer entirely felt. His man, the large one from the hotel, was visible at the far end of the hall. "Lillian," he said. "A moment." "No," she said, and kept walking. He fell into step beside her. "I want to make you an offer. Before the letters come in. Before this goes somewhere neither of us can take back." She stopped walking and turned to face him because she wanted to see his face when she said what she was about to say. "There is nowhere this can go that I want to take back," she said. "I want you to understand that." "You're angry," he said. "I understand that. You feel that I wronged you. Perhaps I did. Perhaps I was not as careful with your reputation as I should have been when you left. Perhaps we could agree on some form of restitution. My testimony isn't for sale," she said. "Margaret's letters aren't for sale. Agnes Croft's 4 years of grief are not for sale." She held his gaze. "There is no number, Howard. There is no version of this where you talk your way out of that room." Something happened in his face. Not the smile breaking that had been gone since the morning at the ranch. Something underneath the composure. The first real crack. "You know what happens to women who make enemies of men with my connections?" he said very quietly. "I know exactly what happens," she said. "I've been living it for 3 years, and I'm still standing in front of you." She stepped back. "Go back inside." She turned and walked away from him, and her hands were entirely steady, and she did not look back. Jake was at the end of the hall. He had seen the exchange from a distance, had watched without moving, which told her he had trusted her to handle it. And the trust was not nothing. "All right?" he said. "Yes," she said. They went back inside. The letters came in after the break. Cord entered them as Exhibit 4-5 and 6-3 letters in Howard Vance's handwriting to 3 different men in 3 different counties, containing instructions explicit enough that Cavendish's objection to their admission was overruled before he finished making it. Judge Crane read each letter himself, which he was not required to do. He read them slowly and completely, and the room watched him read them, and the room understood by the quality of his silence what the letters contained. Then Cord called Margaret Vance. Margaret walked to the witness chair with the careful, deliberate pace of a woman who has made a decision she knows is permanent and is not looking for permission. She sat down. She looked at Cord. She did not look at her husband. Vance's attorney jumped up before Cord could begin. "Your Honor, I must object to this witness on grounds of spousal privilege." "Mr. Vance's counsel can object," Judge Crane said. "Mr. Vance is not currently a party to this proceeding as a defendant. He is a named individual in a territorial fraud complaint. Spousal privilege applies differently in this context. And furthermore," he looked over his glasses, "Mrs. Vance appears to be testifying voluntarily. Objection overruled. Proceed, Mr. Cord." Cord asked Margaret 3 questions. Where she obtained the letters, how long she had kept them, whether they were in her husband's handwriting. She answered all 3 without hesitation, without drama, in the clear, precise voice of a woman who had been holding this moment in her chest for a very long time, and was now simply setting it down. Cavendish cross-examined for 7 minutes. He suggested the letters had been obtained improperly. He suggested Margaret's memory of receiving them was unreliable. He suggested her motivations were personal rather than civic. Margaret Vance looked at him and said, "My motivations are entirely personal. I watched my husband destroy people for 11 years. That is personal. The letters are real." The room shifted. It was not loud. There was no dramatic reaction, no voices from the gallery. It was a shift in the quality of the air, the particular change that happens in a room when a collective understanding moves from uncertain to settled. Gerald Pratt felt it. Lillian watched him feel. It watched the moment land on his face and get absorbed, and not quite process the way a man receives information that contradicts a belief he has held so long it has become structural. He looked at Cavendish. Cavendish gave him the smallest shake of his head. Then Cal Briggs walked through the side door of the town hall. He walked directly to Cord and handed him a folded document, and Cord opened it, and whatever was in it made something in Cord's careful, economical face open briefly into something that looked very much like satisfaction. "Your Honor," Cord said, "I'd like to enter one additional exhibit, a sworn affidavit from the Honorable Judge Matthew Harlan of Laramie, retired, regarding the circumstances of an appeal reversal in a land case 2 years prior, in which the named party was Howard Vance." Cavendish stood up. "Your Honor, this is completely irregular." "Sit down, Mr. Cavendish," Judge Crane said again in exactly the same tone as before. Cal met Lillian's eyes from across the room and gave her a single nod. He and Denny had ridden 80 miles in the dark and come back with what they needed. There was no drama in how he delivered the news. There never was with Cal. Judge Crane read the affidavit. The room waited. Pratt broke first. Not publicly, not in any way that the formal record would capture. But during the second recess, Lillian watched him have a short, quiet conversation with Cavendish in the corner of the room, and she watched the conversation go badly from Pratt's perspective. And she watched Pratt look at the table where Cord's exhibits were laid out and do a calculation with his eyes that ended somewhere he did not want to be. He left the room during the recess and did not come back. Cavendish continued without him, which was the professional obligation of a man who had been retained and had not been released, but the absence of Pratt changed the temperature of everything. A room from which its most powerful person has retreated is a different room. Cord called Lillian last. She had expected to be nervous. She was not nervous. She was something else. Something she did not have a precise word for, a state of readiness that had been building for 3 years and had finally arrived at the moment it was built for. She sat in the witness chair and answered Cord's questions clearly and completely. She described the 8 months in Denver. She described the afternoon she had come back to the office early. She described what she had heard, and who she had heard it from, and the specific names and counties and amounts she had recorded in a ledger she no longer possessed, but had spent 11 pages reconstructing from memory. She described leaving Denver. She described 3 years of running. She described arriving in Caldwell with 37 cents and being met at the fence of her options by Gerald Pratt, and then by Jake Walker. Cavendish cross-examined for 25 minutes. He was thorough, he was skilled, and he accomplished nothing. Lillian's memory was too precise to be shaken by imprecision, and her composure was too complete to be cracked by implication, and every time he tried to introduce the narrative of instability and confusion that Vance had spent 3 years constructing, she simply waited for the question to end, and then answered it with a specificity that left no room for the story he was trying to tell. At one point he said, "You've admitted your marriage to Mr. Walker was arranged quickly and under unusual circumstances." "Yes," she said. "Some might characterize it as arranged for strategic purposes." "Yes," she said again. "It was. That doesn't make it false." He paused, uncertain how to work with an admission that contained no apology. "No further questions," he said. She stood up and walked back to her seat, and Jake was there, and she sat down beside him, and neither of them said anything, because nothing needed to be said right then. Judge Crane ruled before the end of the day, which surprised everyone except possibly Cord, who had estimated the weight of the evidence with the accuracy of someone who had been doing this for long enough to know what a clear case felt like. The ruling was detailed and precise, and went on for 20 minutes, and the substance of it was this: the complaint was sustained in full. The evidence established a coordinated pattern of document fraud across multiple counties. The matter was referred to territorial authorities for criminal proceedings. Gerald Pratt, as a named beneficiary of the fraudulent transactions, was required to appear before the territorial court within 30 days. Howard Vance was to be detained pending that referral. Agnes Croft's land would be reviewed for restoration under territorial restitution provisions. Judge Crane set down his papers and looked at the room. "I want to say something that is not part of the formal record," he said. "This county has been living under a particular kind of quiet pressure for several years. The people who brought this complaint forward did so at considerable personal risk. The courage required to do that, especially when the system that is supposed to protect people has been the instrument of their harm, is not a small thing." He paused. "This court thanks them." Vance's large companion attempted to leave through the side door at that moment and found Cal Briggs standing in the doorway. Cal was not a large man. He was also not a man who moved when he had decided not to move. The large companion looked at him for a moment and then sat back down. When the room began to clear, Agnes Croft came to Lillian and took her hand in both of hers and held it without saying anything for a long moment. Then she said, "My husband would have liked you very much." Lillian felt the words land somewhere deep and true. "Thank you, Agnes." Margaret Vance was at the back of the room with a traveling bag at her feet, which told Lillian she had already arranged not to go back to wherever Howard Vance would be going. She met Lillian's eyes across the clearing room and nodded once, the nod of a woman who has closed a door and is standing in the hallway, deciding what comes next. Lillian nodded back. Outside the town hall, Gerald Pratt was already gone. His horse was gone from the hitching post. His attorneys were speaking quietly to each other on the boardwalk, with the expressions of men recalibrating their professional relationships. The county that had belonged to Pratt this morning was a different county by evening. Tid. Jake found her on the steps of the town hall, standing in the late afternoon light, with her arms at her sides, looking at the street where she had walked 23 days ago, with 37 cents and a broken bag latch and nowhere to go. He stood beside her. She said, "It's done." "Nearly," he said. "The territorial proceedings will take time. But the shape of it is done." "Yes," he said, "the shape of it is done." She looked at the street for another moment. At the mercantile where the door had been opened to her eventually. At the post office where Denny had reported a man asking for Mrs. Walker. At the dress shop with the thin bell above the door where a woman had said, "I can't help you. I'm sorry," with something that might have been sympathy. "I walked this street," she said, "and every door was closed." "Yes." And now, Jake was quiet for a moment. "Now you own a name in this county," he said. "Not borrowed, not arranged, the name held." She turned to look at him. The afternoon light was long, and the street was beginning to empty, and somewhere down the road, Walker Ranch was waiting with its 4 rooms and its south side garden, and its bolt on the inside of the bedroom door. She looked at Jake Walker, this man who had filed papers before speaking to her, who had thought about most things before he did them, whose mother had made a practical marriage and called it sense, and felt the particular clarity of a moment when everything that has been complicated becomes suddenly irrevocably simple. "Let's go home," she said. It was the first time she had called it that. Jake heard it. She could tell by the way he went still for just a moment before he moved. "Yes," he said. "Let's go home." The ride home from Caldwell was quiet, in the way that things are quiet after something large has passed through. Not empty quiet, full quiet. The kind that has weight and texture and doesn't need to be filled. Cal and Denny rode ahead, which Lillian understood was not accidental. Cal Briggs had a talent for placing himself exactly where his presence was needed, and removing himself exactly when it wasn't, and this was a moment that didn't need him. The wagon moved at an easy pace, and the late afternoon stretched long around them, and neither Jake nor Lillian spoke for the first several miles. It was Jake who broke it, and he broke it sideways the way he always approached things that mattered. "Cord says the territorial proceedings will take 3 to 4 months, he said. "You'll need to be available for additional testimony." "I know. Which means staying in the county." "I know that too." A pause. The wagon moved. "I want to be clear about something," Jake said. "The arrangement we made, the reason we made it, those circumstances are resolved now. Pratt's case is collapsing. Vance is in custody. You have legal standing in this county under your own name." He kept his eyes on the road ahead. "You're not trapped here by necessity anymore." Lillian looked at the side of his face. "Is that your way of telling me I'm free to go?" she said. "It's my way of telling you that if you stay, it should be because you want to, not because the situation requires it." She was quiet for a moment. "Jake," she said, "when did you stop thinking of this as temporary?" He was quiet long enough that she thought he might not answer. "About 10 days in," he said. "When you came to breakfast the morning after, I told you I'd written to Cord without telling you first. I thought you'd be gone. I came into the kitchen, and you were at the stove, and you said, 'I'm still angry, but I'm still here.'" He paused. "I stopped thinking of it as temporary somewhere in the space between those 2 sentences." Lillian looked at the road ahead. "I stopped the night I told you about Denver," she said. "The whole of it, not the strategic version." She paused. "I have never told anyone the whole of it. I told you because I needed you to know it before the hearing, but that wasn't entirely honest. I told you because I wanted you to know it. There's a difference, and I knew the difference when I was doing it." The wagon kept moving. "So," Jake said, "So," she said. Another silence, but a different kind. The silence of two people who have said the essential thing and are now sitting with it, seeing what it feels like in the open air. "I'd like to plant the garden," Lillian said. "The south side one, your mother's." Jake turned to look at her. "It needs work," he said. "I know. I've been looking at it for 3 weeks calculating what it needs." That's a significant project." "Yes," she said. "It is." She met his eyes. "I'm not interested in small projects, Jake." Something in his face broke open, not dramatically, not with any of the language of romance she had learned to distrust. Just a man's face when a particular kind of tension releases when something held carefully for a long time is finally allowed to be what it is. "All right," he said. "The garden." "And other things," she said. "And other things," he agreed. They rode the rest of the way home in silence, and the silence was the happiest either of them had been in a very long time. The first thing Lillian did when they got back to the ranch was go to her room and sit on the edge of the bed and put her face in her hands and let 3 years of running catch up with her all at once. Not crying. She had done very little crying through any of this because there had never been a safe moment for it. But the kind of release that happens when a body finally understands it can stop bracing, that moved through her like a slow tide and left her feeling emptied out in the best possible way. She heard Jake's boots on the porch. Then the kitchen. Then nothing, which meant he was giving her the room she needed. She lifted her face from her hands. The bolt on the inside of the door was right there. She had slid it home every night for 23 days, not from fear of Jake. She had understood that quickly, but from the habit of a woman who had learned that a locked door was the difference between a bad situation and a manageable one. She looked at the bolt for a moment. Then she left it open and went back to the kitchen. Jake was making coffee. He looked at her when she came in, and whatever he saw in her face made him set the coffee pot down and simply look at her for a moment without speaking. "I left the bolt," she said. He understood what she meant. "Good." "It doesn't mean anything dramatic," she said. "It means I'm not afraid of this house." "I know what it means," he said. She sat down at the table, their table now, the one where everything had been decided, and put her hands flat on the wood. "What happens tomorrow?" she said. "Tomorrow Cal takes the territorial summons to Morrison and Bell, because now that Pratt's case is collapsing, their agreements with him are worth considerably less than they were yesterday, and he wants them to understand that." Jake poured 2 cups and brought them to the table. "Cord will start preparing the formal submission to territorial court. Agnes Croft is meeting with a land attorney about the restitution process. And Vance, territorial custody in Cheyenne. His attorney will file for a hearing, but with the letters with your testimony with Judge Harlan's affidavit, Cord says the case is as close to airtight as these things get. And Pratt." Jake sat down across from her. "Pratt is a man who has spent 15 years making himself the only option in a county. When you stop being the only option you have, to figure out who you actually are without that." He paused. "I don't think Gerald Pratt knows the answer to that question." Lillian picked up her coffee cup. "He'll try to rebuild." "Probably. We'll need to watch for that." "We will," Jake said. She noticed the we. She thought he noticed her noticing it. 3 days after the hearing, Agnes Croft came to Walker Ranch for supper. She arrived with a jar of preserved plums, and the information that her meeting with the land attorney had gone well, and the restitution process, while slow, was genuinely underway. She sat at the table and ate the meal Lillian had cooked, and talked about the land she was going to get back, with the matter-of-fact determination of a woman who has always known what she wanted, and has simply been waiting to be allowed to have it. "My husband would have said it took too long," Agnes said. "He always hated waiting. He had no patience for the slow kind of justice." "Is there a fast kind?" Lillian asked. He thought there should be. Agnes picked up her coffee cup. "I've made my peace with slow. Slow got there eventually." After supper, Agnes sat on the porch with Jake while Lillian cleared the table, and Lillian could hear their voices through the window. Low, unhurried, the voices of 2 people who have lived hard land and understand each other's vocabulary without needing to explain it. She could not hear the specific words, but she could hear the texture of it, and the texture was warm, and it settled around her like something she had not known she was missing. When Agnes left, Jake came back inside and found Lillian standing at the kitchen window. "She told me," he said, "that you remind her of someone." "Who?" She wouldn't say. She just smiled. He paused. With Agnes, a smile is a significant thing. Lillian turned from the window. "Jake, I want to ask you something." "Ask." "When you went to the livery stable that first morning when you were standing in the shadow and watching me, how long had you been there?" He was quiet for a moment. "Long enough to watch you refuse Pratt," he said. "Long enough to watch you walk the length of Main Street twice and try every door." He paused. "Long enough to understand what I was looking at." "What were you looking at?" "A woman who had nothing left to lose and still wouldn't give up what she was." He met her eyes across the kitchen. "That is not a common thing, Lily." She held his gaze. "You took a significant risk." "Yes." "On a stranger with 37 cents in a broken bag." "The broken bag was what convinced me," he said. And there was something in his voice that was not quite humor, and not quite tenderness, but was in the country between the two. "A woman who holds a broken bag shut with both hands for 40 minutes, because it's all she has left. That woman is not going to fall apart on you." Lillian looked at him for a long moment. "Your mother would have liked this story," she said. "She would have said it was completely obvious from the first 5 minutes how it was going to end," he said. "And then she would have been insufferably right about it." The letter from Margaret Vance arrived 2 weeks after the hearing, postmarked from Santa Fe. It was short. Margaret was not a woman who needed many words. She said she had found a room in a respectable boarding house and was looking for work as a music teacher, which she had been trained as before. Howard had decided a wife's working was a reflection on him. She said the lawyer handling her situation believed she had strong grounds for a legal separation. She said she was sleeping through the night for the first time in years. At the end, she wrote, "I want you to know that watching you in that courtroom was the clearest thing I had seen in a very long time. You reminded me that a person can decide to stop diminishing themselves. I had forgotten that was a choice available to me. Thank you for reminding me." Lillian read the letter twice, and then folded it carefully and put it in the wooden box she had started keeping on the shelf above the writing desk in the back bedroom. Her room, though she had begun to think of the whole house as hers, in a way that had nothing to do with arrangement, and everything to do with the particular sense of belonging that cannot be manufactured and cannot be rushed. She told Jake about the letter over supper. He listened. Then he said, "Santa Fe. That's a long way from Denver." "Yes." "Good distance." "I thought so too." He was quiet for a moment. "What did you write back?" "I told her that music teachers are always needed," Lillian said, "and that Santa Fe has good weather, and that the choice she mentioned, the one she had forgotten, it gets easier once you've made it the first time. The second time is almost simple." "Is that true?" She considered it honestly. "I think so," she said. "I think the first time is the one that costs everything. After that, your legs remember how to stand." Jake looked at her across the table, with the steady, direct attention she had come to understand was the most honest thing about him. A man who did not look away from things that mattered, who did not soften them by looking somewhere else. "Your legs always knew how to stand," he said. "You just needed ground." 6 weeks after the hearing, Franklin Cord sent word from Cheyenne that Howard Vance had entered a formal guilty plea to 3 counts of document fraud in exchange for a reduced sentence, and that his cooperation with territorial authorities had implicated 2 additional operations in neighboring territories that investigators had been trying to build cases against for years. The plea agreement required him to provide full documentation of every fraudulent transaction conducted through his land acquisition company for the past 7 years. Cord's letter closed with a single dry sentence. "It is my professional assessment that Mr. Vance is discovering somewhat late in life the practical disadvantages of keeping meticulous records." Jake read it aloud at the breakfast table, and Cal, who was eating with them, because Lillian had started setting a plate for him without being asked, and he had started sitting down without asking, made a sound that was the closest he ever came to a laugh. "Meticulous records," Cal said, "meaning your 11 pages. "Among other things," Lillian said. "You kept his books for 8 months," Cal said. "And then you rebuilt them from memory." He shook his head slowly. "He hired the wrong bookkeeper." "He hired exactly the wrong bookkeeper," Lillian agreed. Gerald Pratt's matter moved more slowly, as local corruption cases tended to do. There were more people to implicate, more arrangements to unwind. More county officials who had been operating inside Pratt's system for long enough that they could not immediately remember what operating outside it looked like. But it moved. Morrison and Bell, once released from their financial agreements with Pratt, proved eager witnesses. The county clerk, who had been managing title records with a particular flexibility, resigned 2 weeks after the hearing and left Caldwell without a forwarding address, which was its own kind of testimony. Agnes Croft's land was formally restored to her on a Tuesday morning in October, which she marked by driving out to the property and walking the boundary line alone, which she had done with her husband every spring for 22 years. She came to Walker Ranch afterward and told Lillian about it, and her voice was steady, and her eyes were bright, and she said, "He would have liked to see it. I told him about it anyway." Lillian put her hand over Agnes's and held it. "I think he knows," she said. Agnes looked at her. "You believe that?" "I believe people we love don't entirely leave," Lillian said. "I think they stay in the things they built, and the ground they tended, and the people who carry them forward." She paused. "I think that land is full of him." Agnes was quiet for a long moment. "Yes," she said finally. "I suppose it is." The South Side Garden was Lillian's project through October and into November. Clearing the overgrowth, amending the soil, making decisions about what to keep and what to let go, and what to plant new in the spring. Jake helped on the weekends without being asked, which she had come to understand was his way of saying things he was still working up to saying directly. One Saturday morning, he was pulling up the remnants of a frost-killed tomato vine when he said without looking up from his work, "My mother grew those along the east side. She said the fence gave them something to hold on to." "I'll put them back there in the spring," Lillian said. He looked up. "You've got it all planned out." "I've been planning it since I first saw it," she said. 3 days after I arrived. I was standing at the window and I looked at it and I thought someone loved this. Someone put this here on purpose, and it went on growing even when the person who planted it was gone. She looked at him. "I thought that's what I want to do. Make something that goes on." Jake set down the vine in his hands. "Lily," he said. "I know," she said. "I know what I'm saying." He stood up and crossed the few feet between them and stood in front of her. And he was not a man who made declarations. She understood that about him had understood it almost immediately, that the things he felt deepest, he expressed in the least amount of words, and that this was not absence, but the opposite of absence. It was the compression of something very large into the smallest possible container. "I stopped pretending this was temporary a long time ago," he said. She looked at him. "So did I." He nodded once. Then, "I want to ask you something." "Ask?" "You came here with 37 cents and nowhere to go. You stayed because the situation required it. Then you stayed because the case required it." He held her gaze. "I want to know if there's a version where you stay because you want to. Not the arrangement, not the strategy, just this." She thought about 37 cents. She thought about the morning stage from Cheyenne, and the broken bag latch, and the door of every possibility closing before she reached it. She thought about a man leaning in the shadow of a livery stable who had looked at her once with steady gray eyes and offered her a shield made of a lie. She thought about the lie becoming something else. Not gradually, she could not point to a single moment, but the way a season changes in the accumulation of ordinary days until one morning you look up and everything is different, and you cannot say exactly when it started being different, only that it is. "Jake," she said, "I'm standing in your mother's garden planning what to plant in the spring. My clothes are in the back bedroom. My box of letters is on the shelf above the writing desk. Cal sets a plate for me without being asked, and I set a plate for him without asking." She paused. "I let the bolt go 3 weeks after I arrived. Did you know that?" He was quiet. "I heard it," he said. "The first night you didn't slide it home. I was in the main room and I heard it not happen." She looked at him. "And you didn't say anything?" "It wasn't mine to say anything about," he said. "It was yours." She held his gaze for a long moment. This man who gave her room to be afraid, and room to stop being afraid, and never once required her to perform either state for his comfort. This man who thought about most things before he did them, and had thought about her before he met her, and had been right about what he was looking at from the shadow of a livery stable on a Thursday morning in October. "I want to stay," she said. "Not because of the situation, not because of the case, because this is where I want to be." She paused. "Because you are who I want to be near." Jake Walker put his hand against her face, just briefly, just one moment, and then he said, "Then stay." "I intend to," she said. Denny found them still in the garden an hour later, and had the good sense to pretend he'd come to ask about the fence post on the north side, which he had not come to ask about at all. And Jake answered the question about the fence post without indicating anything unusual had occurred. And Denny went back to the north fence, with the expression of a young man doing careful work not to smile. Cal was at supper that evening, and he looked at Lillian, and he looked at Jake, and he said nothing whatsoever, which was Cal Briggs's version of everything he needed to say. Lillian served the meal and sat down, and it was an ordinary supper at an ordinary table in a working ranch house in Wyoming Territory in the autumn of 1881, and it was also the most complete thing Lillian Hayes had felt in more years than she wanted to count. After supper, she wrote a letter to the woman in Denver who had given her a letter of reference and probably regretted it. She told her she had found work. She told her she was well. She told her she had found something she had not known she was looking for, which was a place where the door did not close when she came toward it. She did not mail the letter until the following week, because she read it over and wanted to make sure every word in it was true. Every word was. In December, Cord sent the final territorial ruling. Vance's guilty plea was accepted. Pratt's county-level case was formally referred for trial. 3 additional counties had opened investigations based on documentation produced through the plea agreement. Judge Harlan, retired in Laramie, sent a personal note to Jake, saying he was grateful someone had finally pulled the thread he'd been watching dangle for 2 years. Agnes Croft sent a jar of preserved tomatoes from the first harvest of her restored land, with a note that said, "Only from the ground that holds him. Thank you." Lillian put the jar on the kitchen shelf where she could see it from the table. Jake noticed it there one morning and looked at it, and then looked at her, and she said, "Agnes." He nodded and said nothing, and went about his morning, and the jar stayed on the shelf all winter and into the spring, and every time Lillian looked at it, she thought about things that survive. On a morning in late February, Lillian went out to the south side garden in the early cold to assess what the winter had done and what the spring would need, and Jake came out behind her with 2 cups of coffee and stood beside her, and they looked at the bare ground together. "It's going to need a lot of work," he said. "Yes," she said, "but it's good ground." It was always good ground. It just needed someone to come back to it. Jake handed her the coffee, and she took it, and their hands were close on the cups in the cold morning air, and the ground in front of them was waiting for spring. "The marriage started as protection," Lillian said, not looking at him, looking at the ground. "Yes." "And then it was strategy." "Yes." "And then it was evidence and legal proceedings and territorial court." "Yes," he said. "And now," she turned to look at him. Jake Walker, who had been standing in the shadow of a livery stable on the worst morning of her life, and had looked at her once and seen something worth standing in front of, who had filed papers before the conversation, who had given her a room with a bolt on the inside of the door, who had listened without interrupting and said, "You're not facing him alone anymore," and meant it in every way a person can mean something. "Now it's just true," she said. He looked at her. "Yes," he said, "it is." The woman who had arrived in Caldwell with 37 cents and nowhere to go stood in her garden in the Wyoming winter with coffee warming her hands, and she was home, not because a lie had become truth, but because two people had stopped calling each other temporary, and that in the end was the only definition of home that had ever mattered.